The German Empire. It was founded when the South German states, except Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Austria, joined the North German Confederation. The King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, became emperor, and the minister-president of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, became chancellor. As an European colonial empire, Britain and France were Germany's biggest enemies, but Germany had the lead. In 1850, they started rapid industrialization, which allowed them to increase their population by more than 50%, become the largest economy in Europe and the third largest in the world. Their factories were bigger and better than the British and French ones. They had the strongest army in the world. Their navy was second only to the British, and they were also a pioneer in science, having received 1/3 of all Nobel Prizes. All of that was achieved in only 47 years. Also, some social welfare systems we see in Europe to this day were introduced by Bismarck, like old age pensions, medical care, and unemployment insurance. During its colonization of Africa, Germany committed the Herero and Nama genocide. It happened between 1904 and 1908. Around 100,000 Nama and Herero died in total, mostly from starvation and dehydration, but also abuse in concentration camps. In 1890, Wilhelm II removed Bismarck, and this is where Germany started to fall off. The German people started increasingly oppressing the Polish people, and it eventually led to World War I. The empire fell in 1918 when it lost the war to France and her allies, and the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to pay around $30 billion in reparations. Adjusted to inflation today, that's nearly $250 billion. The Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is considered by many to be the most impressive, powerful, memorable, and important civilization in history. Following the death of the last Republican dictator, Caesar Augustus was the first emperor. Throughout its history, Rome had around 70 emperors in total. Together with ancient Greece, the Roman Empire was the birth of Western civilization. They invented the Julian calendar, books, newspapers, concrete, roads, surgery, aqueducts, the postal service, firefighters, and a lot more. For a very long time, Rome was the epicenter of technology and science in the entire world. The empire was mostly focused around the Mediterranean Sea, since that's where most of the world's power and money was at the time. But that didn't stop Rome from expanding to the north. During most of its lifetime, the Romans were seen in the entire world as pretty much undefeatable. Almost every time Rome tried to conquer a country, they succeeded, but not always. They failed to conquer Scotland and Germany, which showed the world that the Romans were not gods. They weren't undefeatable. Eventually, those defeats turned into many revolts and rebellions throughout the empire, which was vast, rich, and strong, but very politically unstable. In a desperate attempt of trying to contain the revolts, in 395 AD, the Roman Empire was split into West and East. The Eastern Empire became the Byzantine Empire and lasted for more than 1,000 years, until 1453. The Western Empire only lasted 81 years. It eventually fell when the Germans, who were one of the very few people to have ever successfully expelled the Romans from their land, killed Romulus Augustus in 476 AD. The fall of the Western Roman Empire officially marks the start of the Middle Ages. The Dutch Empire. The Dutch Empire wasn't a normal one. It was a lot more about money rather than influence. A lot more about trading rather than exploitation. Although it did have its fair share of slavery too. Usually the person in charge of an empire is the emperor or king, but for the Dutch it wasn't. And that's because the Dutch Empire wasn't really ruled over by a government. It was actually owned by a private company, or two companies actually. The Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, and the Dutch West India Company, known as the WIC. The WIC was founded after the VOC, and it took care of business on the western part of the planet. They colonized big parts of Brazil and the United States, which was called New Amsterdam before the British took over and renamed it New York. But even then, the WIC wasn't as successful as its eastern counterpart. The VOC was a pioneer in capitalism. It was the first joint stock company in the world, which means it was the first company where shareholders can buy and sell stocks of the company. and any citizen of the Dutch Republic could become a shareholder. This company was so powerful that it was almost an entire government by itself. They were able to wage war, imprison and even execute convicts, negotiate treaties, make its own coins, and establish colonies. Just so you have an idea about the sheer immense power of the Dutch monopoly, all of Europe combined for about 300 years sent about 880,000 Europeans to Asia to trade. Meanwhile, the VOC alone, in only 200 years, sent more than 1 million Europeans. The VOC is the wealthiest company ever. Adjusted to inflation, they would be worth around $8 trillion today. Even Apple, Google, and Microsoft combined aren't worth that much. Eventually, the company went bankrupt due to smuggling and corruption and was formally dissolved in 1799. The British Empire. The British Empire is the most powerful and vast empire in history. It's regarded as the empire on which the sun never sets, because the sun is always shining on at least one of its territories. That's because it owned 24% of all land on the planet and 23% of all of the world's population. It's a very controversial one since a lot of people still support the British Empire to this day, even though it was a colonial one. England's biggest enemies at the start of the empire were France and Spain, which held pretty much all of North America in the beginning of the exploration of the Americas. During the 17th and 18th centuries, England won most wars in North America against the French and the Dutch, which made it the superior colonial power there. However, during Napoleon's France and Spain backed the Americans during their fight for independence, and so the British lost all of their territory in the United States, but it still retained most of Canada. After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain came out on top and became the world's absolute superpower. The period between 1815 and 1914 is known as Pax Britannica, where the British absolutely dominated pretty much the whole world. During its colonization of India, the British forced Indian farmers to produce opium instead of food because it was more profitable since they could export it to China. As a result, not enough food was being produced, and so nearly 10 million Indians died of starvation. And so the British raised taxes on the people in order to make up for the lost revenue of those 10 million people dying. After the First World War, Britain could no longer maintain some of its territories and was no longer the world's leader in military and economy. After the Second World War, decolonization started, where Britain began negotiating independence with its colonies. In 1997, Hong Kong was given back to China, symbolizing the end of the British Empire. The Ottoman Empire. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is considered by many to be one of the most important events in world history. It marks the end of the Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, by Mehmed II, nearly 100 years after conquering the Balkans. During the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire reached its peak economical and territorial form. The Ottomans had unquestionable prestige in the Islamic world, having taken over Damascus, Cairo, Medina, Baghdad, Mecca, and Jerusalem, which were all capitals with very major religious importance in the world. Due to being in control of pretty much all of the Mediterranean Sea in Europe, Asia, and Africa, the Ottoman Empire forced the Europeans to expand westward, which led to the colonization and exploration of the Americas. During a time of peace in the mid-18th century, the military was weakened, which made the Ottomans take many defeats and saw the Greek War for Independence in 1829. The empire also lost a lot of territory in the Balkans, but still had a relatively new and modern military. In the early 20th century, the empire went through a coup d'etat after being absolutely destroyed in the Balkan Wars and losing the majority of its territory in Europe. The Balkan Wars was one of the leading actors to the First World War. The Turks decided to ally with the Central Powers during the war, but faced revolts, specifically in Arabia with the Arab Revolt. And just like any empire in history, when the people revolt, it means it's time for genocide. The Ottomans ended up killing around 250,000 Assyrian Christians, 340,000 Greek Ottoman Christians, and 1 million Armenians. On top of that, they forcefully converted around 150,000 women and children to Islam. After the war, the empire lost significant territory to Britain and France, and it was officially dismantled in 1922. The Russian Empire. Peter the Great was the first emperor of the Russian Empire. He was fascinated by ships and the Western world and wanted to transform Russia from an old, outdated, bureaucratic country into a more new, modern, Western-style empire. He built St. Petersburg based on Western cities he had visited during his trips to Europe. During his rule, Russia vastly improved its economy, military strength, education, and scientific community. He worked in a dockyard in Amsterdam, which is where he learned how to make ships, which were later used to defeat the Swedish Empire. Also, he created the Russian flag based on the Dutch flag, just by changing the colors around. Russia was the last absolute monarchy in Europe, which led to many revolts and radicalization of politics, like the rise of communism. In the beginning of the First World War, Russia suffered many defeats which made people dislike the Emperor Nicholas II even more. Eventually, Nicholas resigned, but the government still stayed in the war despite opposition from the population, which led to even more revolts and rebellions. Eventually, the Bolsheviks overthrew the government and left the war, and that led to a civil war between the Red Army, which were the Bolsheviks, and the White Army, which were the enemies of the Bolsheviks and weren't particularly affiliated with any ideology. The Red Army won and established the Soviet Union. The Italian Empire. The Italian Empire was a very short one. After the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini came to power, Italians had a sense of pride by trying to re-establish the Roman Empire. Mussolini promised the Italian people he would do that by colonizing Africa. And so, Libya, Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia were conquered by the Italian troops, and Albania was annexed just a few months before the Second World War started in 1939. Mussolini heavily encouraged the Italian people to move to the colonial territories in Africa, as a way of trying to assert colonial presence there and try to enforce Italian culture on the natives or even replace the native people. That method somewhat worked, considering around 300,000 Italians permanently moved to the colonies. During World War II, Italy managed to occupy Western Egypt, parts of Yugoslavia, Tunisia, parts of southeastern France, and most of Greece. But that wasn't enough to keep its empire, and when the Allies started gaining more traction during the war, Italy lost many battles for its territories and all of its colonies. In 1946, Italy held a referendum which ended the monarchy and instated Italy as a republic.